Good morning, everybody. Are you here to talk about migrations?
Yes.
Good, so am I. But they're kind of for the birds, huh? It's too early. Did everybody have coffee? Hi there. It's 10, so I'm starting because I'm a project manager, and I'll start on time. My name is Amy Diamond. I'm the CEO of Hook 42, but I've been working in technology for a long time, and I'm a principal architect as well. I've been doing enterprise web tech and just enterprise infrastructure tech since 1995, actually, but it's 96 here. I'm a certified project manager, Stanford Advanced Project Manager, Scrum certified product owner, and Scrum certified Scrum Master. And I've been working in lots of enterprise content management systems since 1999, but specifically in Drupal since 2008. I've done lots of migrations of lots of things beyond Drupal, and I'm going to pull some of that information into this presentation. I work with Hook 42. You can talk to us around the corner at the table, but we do specialize in complex projects, including migrations, process automation, and that type of thing. Who are you today? Who is a developer in here? Raise your hand. Okay, so we've got like a third of the room. Who is a project manager? Okay, maybe another third of the room. Product manager? Yeah, okay, a few of them. Who's an executive? Or who has purchasing power? Who writes RFPs? Oh, a couple folks, okay. Who does everything? Okay, a lot of hands up. All right, that's good. Thank you for answering that, because a lot of times I'll tune the language I use based on the audience and based on the familiarity with maybe project management terms and that type of thing, or even Drupal terms. But let's get going. All right, so there's a lot to cover today. I'm going to go fast. Enjoy the ride. The slides are text heavy. Sorry about that, but you'll thank me later. I do have a slide deck on the site already, but don't use that deck. I'm going to upload a newer one because I found spelling errors. I was like, no. And this information, like I did this at DrupalCon, and a lot of people are like, you just talked about a big migration. And we just talked about a Drupal migration as a sample, but this information can be applied to any migration that you work with, right? This is project structure and best practices that apply to anything. So, what we're going to do is we're going to have a sample project to use as to apply some of the information here. We're going to talk a little bit about backgrounds of migrations, and then we're going to go into the detail of each migration phase of the project. So who has migrated a site here? Okay, yeah, a little over half. In one word, describe it.
Painful.
Painful? How about another one? Or does that sum it up? Okay, who read this and went viscerally felt the pain that was, okay, we've got some nods and good, that's what you're supposed to feel. And this helps mitigate that. Especially even if you're a developer, if you're a project manager, if you're the business owner or executive having to sponsor a migration, it gets scary. And let's talk about a possibly scary migration project. So there's a website called nexustravel.com, and this screenshot is taken from the Drupal multilingual demo, which our company created for the Drupal 8 multilingual initiative, but it's got some nice pretty pictures and some content types and that type of thing. And Nexus Travel is an online business that sells pre-planned trips. It was built on the now unsupported Drupal 6, so they have to migrate. The website is very large. It has enterprise-grade features. There are many types of content on the site. And they have custom code and custom data structures. So who's kind of heard of a project like that? Okay, a few, some nods. If you work in government, you probably run into some of these things. About the content, we have a bunch of different types of content. We have some nodes, like locations where you can go and tours. We have user types and roles. We have vendors and members that can purchase the tours. We have so many pretty pictures, which is the image file plus media entities. We have rich content tagging, right? A taxonomic structure to help find and relate data. We have advertisements that are sold to vendors, so a lot of block information that has other information like tied to it. And we also are using commerce to help manage members and trips. So we have commerce entities. That's simple, right? And about the project a little further, they're under a tight timeline because who isn't, right? And the new and improved features that they want with the new site, they haven't yet been fully defined by the business because they're still mulling that over. And the large business investments have already been dependent on a timely release. So they promised something to their customers that they didn't know if they could deliver or not. So they're like, And organic SEO is one of the largest contributors to their business, right? So you can't mess it up when you migrate. So sound familiar project, maybe? Yeah? Okay, some nods. This is a very realistic project. How do you feel right now? Who feels like this? A little apprehensive? Who feels like a superhero and are like, let's take it on? Based on the business constraints that they did, I actually feel technically like a superhero, and architecturally like a superhero, and PM-wise I feel like a superhero, but I think their business decisions make me feel like kind of apprehensive and like, So as a project manager, I have to help educate the client about expectations and that type of thing. So there is that level of like, okay, well, we have to work together to kind of help understand what's happening on the migration. So before we really jump into like details, let's understand migration projects. And they're easy, huh? Right? And sometimes they are easy. But why do you even migrate? So, Drupal 6, end of life, time to migrate. Are we going to Drupal 8? Are you going to Drupal 7? Are you going to WordPress? All sorts of options. Mergers and acquisitions. You've been bought by another company and you have to merge the content or web assets. Sometimes you get a project and fixing the site is far more painful than like a true migration. So you might want to migrate out of a mid-development site because there's like content in there. Maybe you're doing an infrastructure or architecture cleanup, or you're doing a heavy rebranding. And it's another one of those, build a new one, migrate the data over. But there's lots of other reasons why you need to migrate as well. There's a lot of different types of migrations. Sometimes there's one-to-one, and when we say one-to-one, is it data or functionality, or maybe both? Sometimes you need to transform your old data into a new data structure, do some cleanup on it, because business and changes over time, and so does your content and site architecture needs. Sometimes you have multiple sources that need to be pulled into a single source, and like multilingual or internationalized sites is a great example of this. You have a bunch of subdomains, you have to pull them into one. Also, sometimes you have to go from a single source to multiple. Same use case, just flip it around. You have one website and you want to go into multiple websites. And in real life, you may use all types on your project. You might have a lot of complex needs. Maybe you're joining 4 sites into one, that type of thing. Some like frequency of migration. Who thinks you just press the button and it magically goes? Right? Oh, we've got one. Good. That is what I mean. Sometimes you can do that if you have a small enough site. If the migration process itself is pretty clear, and also if you can do a code freeze or a content freeze, right? So that single pass actually can work. But a lot of times when you have a large-scale site or something that has a lot of user-generated content like comments or products that you can't turn the site off for a long time if you have a lot of content, you do incremental. And in real life, your project may use both types, right? So you might have some content that's a single pass, and then you're like, okay, cool, thanks for getting it over, now we're going to manually tweak it. And then also then the other incremental data is the orders and user-generated comments and that type of thing. And when you make the decision about how you migrate, it's dependent on your size, scale, and complexity. So if you have a small amount of content, you might want to just do it manual because it's cheaper, right? If you have enough content to invest in the migration code, this is where you pay for programmers. Sometimes if you have a big content blob, like everything's in the WYSIWYG and you want to split it out into structures like paragraphs, that might be a combination of programming and manual work. And in real life, the biggest thing that hits like the size, scale, and complexity is how many files do you have, or how much content do you have. That really kind of adds layers of complexity because you have to manage time and processing time far closer than just the programming and testing. You can also do multiple technologies. So, thanks Drupal community for writing the Drupal to Drupal migrations. But then there's a lot of other things, like, I'm taking a flat site to Drupal, or it's a custom database to a new Drupal structure, or are you moving from another CMS to Drupal? This is real. And I say, because the community is helping with some of these, but a lot of times you might have to do like a one-off integration because maybe you have a custom written, application that you need to connect to and transform. And in real life, your project may use many types, especially if you're kind of consuming a bunch of sites into one. There's also infrastructure considerations. On Pantheon, like you'll figure it out, like when you're doing migrations, you can't do an MV on a file. They just copy it from one to the other. Their file system's very cool, but when you do a migration, you're like, why? I can't just rename this file, why not? Or this directory. And it's like, in Acquia, the files directory structure, once again, is a bit of a challenge, and trying to deal with a lot of other environments. It's very flexible, but then you're like, I have to really pay attention to what's going on where I'm doing my testing. Also, like if you're using local hosts for migration testing or migration development versus remote, there's a lot of memory issues, and how can you debug better and quickly. Also, network is a huge impact because you actually have to end up migrating to a production server at some point. So if you have lots of files, it will just take time. Transfer speeds, firewalls, access. I need to have one database be accessing another, right? Whoops, I don't have access at that port. And you can't have access because you work in the government and they have a big firewall. How are you going to do that? Right, so you have to take this into account in your project planning, your risks. And this is a big, big impact to your planning. So if you go in knowing what infrastructure you're working with, then you can help mitigate those things. Also, team considerations. Projects can be long. Sometimes under tight constraints, your migration may be after hours. Work is incredibly detail-oriented, so if you have folks that aren't very detail-oriented on your team, you have to be vigilant with that. I can't say how much the careful note-taking is required here. And the work can be intense and passionate. And who likes to work like this for real? Like, nobody does. Sometimes it's like, yes, I made this. But in the end, you want to have some work-life balance. And you need very specialized team members. So you need a migration project manager, somebody who's done it before. You need someone that understands the source data technology because you have to access that data. You might have to access customizations around it to see what's been done with it. You need a migration engineer that's different than just a Drupal developer. That's someone who's written migrate code, who knows how the migration system works and that type of thing. Because there's weird things that happen on migrations with Drupal. And you just have to work with it. You need a migrator, maybe someone who's skilled enough to roll a full site back. Because if something happens, then we need to recover to our last baseline. And also you need a data specialist to do the data QA, because you're moving data back and forth. And the migration project manager basically does planning and education. Anyway, it's all the stuff that I just said. Access to source data, develop the migration code, migrator runs the migrations, and then the data is tested. And where do you get these people, right? I don't know, do you guys have a group of people that are ready to do migration sitting in your back pocket? No. And so you want to work with folks that have done it before, even if you have a couple of people on your team that's done it before that can educate the rest. It certainly does help migration projects. Also, there's many other role-specific considerations, and this is my empathy slide. Just think of others in context of your migration project. So everybody has different needs on a migration project. In the end, you want to just make sure it's easier on your team and simplify where you can. And we do this with spreadsheets. And there's no cell left behind. And no, really lots of spreadsheets because they have a lot of moving parts and the devil's in the details, right? And we'll get into some fun examples. And why not a bug tracker? So we use a bug tracker to track like conceptual progress, but a lot of times you'll have a lot of metadata about the data that you're using on migrations. And to set up all the custom things in Jira or anything, it's just so much time. And a lot of people just know how to use spreadsheets, right? You can put them in Google Docs or Office 365 and you can consume the information without having to fight a system. And you want to focus on the real information, which is your migration, right? So you don't want to fight anything else. And I felt like this here, you're going to have a lot of data, and it's not the little stack. We're talking about this stack, right? So it's pretty interesting. But I do feel like, yeah, see this stack of paper? That's what you want. We didn't talk about what data is on these spreadsheets yet, but really, you need to track data. Even if it's a small site, you want to make sure you're thorough. Because thorough planning and vigilant management leads to project success, and the numbers prove it. So first you have to start to get started, and let's do the Agile versus Waterfall battle. Okay, so order of operations is super important in migration projects, and also so is sign-off and commitment, because if you start changing things, it gets very costly in time and money, and then people get very tired. So that's Waterfall. Waterfall's great for that. But Agile, like how do you incorporate some Agile principles so your developers and everything can benefit from it? But basically having that Agile meeting structure and reporting structure and language provides a very rapid acceptance process. Okay, so you're not Waterfall, like accepted at the very end. You have deliverables being kind of like accept when you're done, accepted as soon as the developer is done moment. So you kind of move the project on very assertively. So anyway, let's get into the big phases of migration project. There's 10. But they're in 3 chunks. First is getting started, then you build stuff, and then you do the migrations. All right, so those are conceptually 3 chunks. Now, this is what a project looks like visually. You must do the first getting started in a waterfall fashion, because one chunk of information leads to another, and you can't really start the other until one is finished. Then, when you start building stuff, you can have some overlap because, hey, you can start the infrastructure, and then you can start some of the definitions as soon as some of those things have been rapidly accepted in your Agile-based meeting structure. You can start developing the migration for those. And so what you can see is you have this kind of finish to start model, but staggered, right? So then when you start doing your pre-production migrations, you're testing and iterating and bug fixing all at once. So that's like a finish for that whole phase. You're not really done until you're like done. And all of those things happen at the same time. And then when you go live, it comes back to a waterfall type of look, because you prepare to live. You go live and then you test stuff. So really in the land of time, it's not an Agile thing. It's just like, I'm done with this now, I'm starting this next task. Right, so it looks like that. I'll do a little bit of more of this later as well, but it's super helpful to visualize this, and this is part of the first step, which is educating your business team. So if we get started, the first 3 phases are pre-project education, audit for migration, and discovery. Your pre-project education is basically telling the business, hey, look at this is what the schedule kind of looks like. Conceptually, it's not even time. This is how we're going to do this project. You set expectations of project activities and clarify the impact of requirements freeze on budget and calendar. And you also identify possible phase statements of work, because a lot of times you can't fix bid a migration if it's really big, because you just don't know, because you haven't uncovered the cruft. So a lot of times you can do the first chunk of the SOW, it'd be a first engagement is let's do the migration and planning. And then we can scope really what your migration cost is going to look like. So those that write RFPs and start doing project structures, it'll work in a structure that vendors are going to come back. It's very hard to identify the cost of a migration project. And in real life, it's really ready when it's ready. Smaller sites, it's easier to say that. Very large sites, like, oh my gosh, you just added a feature that's going to add a lot of time to this project. It's rougher to handle on the project and account management end. So migration projects take time, specialization, requirements, lockdown, project fitness, and for those project managers here, and transparency across the team. So on our sample site, their undefined features are at a risk to schedule, so we educate them. Their aggressive schedule may impact the developer work-life balance, and so that is always a risk. Like we can't do that for more than like 2 sprints without getting like a decreased return of their work. And also they need to start maybe mitigating their customer expectations that they promised the new features for, because their site's probably too big for what they want to do within their launch dates, within their budget. The audit for migration is the second phase. First of all, you want to surface the as-is details of the current site. This is details, like, and you want to understand what their data looks like, and you want to get familiar with the site functionality. And this is when you also say, hey, did you guys know that you have this feature? And they're like, oh yeah, we built that 5 years ago and we forgot. It just sits there, right? And out of this goal, this audit, you start getting your risk register. Your content audit has like counts of content, types of content, surface custom content. This is where you start getting like the glossary of how they call things on their site. Maybe 5 years ago when it was programmed, what the programmers called it doesn't match, and what the glossary is going to be in the future. And also, since SEO is important, this is where you get all the source URLs to use for redirects to your new site later. And also infrastructure. Hey, are you guys hosted beyond a firewall? How do we access this information? And here's your artifacts. So, that's a duplicate page. How did that happen? Anyway, I'm going to do a shameless plug for DNS settings right now. Okay, so when you go live, you're like, yeah, let's switch the domain. Why isn't it working? It's because somebody forgot to change the time to life. And sometimes they're very long. But what you want to do is at the very beginning of the project, figure out who has DNS control. And do they have a month request lead time to change that DNS, and what DNS value should be changed to? Because when you do go live, you want to switch it over and switch it quick and be able to switch it back if something happens. So shameless plug for DNS research right now. Get to know who the IT people are, because they might not be the web team. Lessons learned here, very few developers know how to do a thorough audit for migration. And it takes longer than you expect, but it's shorter than auditing twice and auditing later because you missed something. Also, no cell left behind. Never leave a blank cell in your spreadsheet. Just say it's not applicable, right? Because you know that you've visited that information and somebody has like consumed it and made a decision. And also keep all your artifacts and information in one place. So what we do is we have like maybe 3 spreadsheets that become kind of large over the course of a project. It's the migration mapping, it's the content architecture, and it's a go live checklist. Maybe 4 is the original site audit. But those 4 single documents are where your developers and your business, they see all of the information. Put it all in one directory. It's great, because then it really simplifies where everybody gets the information, so people can't say, oh, I didn't think about that, or I didn't know about that. So it really simplifies environments. So based on our test site, we have 50,000 members, we have 60,000 pictures, and it's disorganized, and there's bad file names and missing files, and there's a lot of select lists that need to be transformed into new vocabularies in the future. So there's a lot of stuff going on. So this is an interesting level of site. All of this is real data from different projects that I've done. I've incorporated into this use case. So this is real number. So basically, I'm not going to talk about the discovery phase too much because that's a whole 800 different sessions. But the goal specifically for migration is at this point you ask the expectation of your data transformation, right? Like, oh, this data, does it need to be cleaned up? Do we keep this data? Does it go away? Does it transform into different areas? And this is where you re-educate the business one more time with the findings, because you're going to keep uncovering information and go, oh my gosh, I found this, this custom thing over here. Because this is what happens. The more and more you're delving into their code and understand their functionality, you'll see weird things with data. You also look at the data historically and go, why is there like 2 years ago a big blank area where there's no dates? Oh, well, we had a bug in this custom module we wrote and it didn't enter the dates. But when you migrate it, it will fail because it's a null cell. So you have to figure out, oh, well, what does that data look like? So this is the level of depth of what you need to do to look at this migration information. And then you always leverage the tools that you made in the phase before it. So you add new risks, add new mitigation ideas, and leverage the audit spreadsheets for nomenclature. And at this point, you define the feature list, feature requirements, and you create the project glossary, with also known as, like, does the machine name look different than what they call it? And then you elaborate. One of the biggest things that you want to do in the audit is get representative URLs and links, because a lot of times you'll have content that has lots of different fields that may do different things under certain circumstances. So the migrate team, the migrate developer, if you give them a list of use case type your representative links, like, oh, this is the logged in member, and this is the admin, this is what everything looks like, then they can go in and check each one of those types of links to see if their data is coming through. And it's great for the end-to-end testing as well. Otherwise, then like, there's 60,000 pieces of data, which one do I look at, right? So it helps speed up the process. So for our Nexus travel site, we want to keep all the old data, we want to transform select lists. The content team wants to make new content for paid landing pages before the site goes live, so at some point, something somewhere has to have users in it to create new content and maybe imagery. So at some point in the middle of our migration project, they need to start working on the new site. So it becomes like live production. It's non-live production, if you will. And then when they say most functionality is the same, totally don't trust your client ever or your stakeholders until they sign off on the requirements, because they'll be like, oh, wait, no. It's most of the functionality plus this thing, plus that thing, plus that thing. And then you're like, oh, you just want to rebuild that. Okay, great, thanks. And as project managers, you can probably connect with them. So let's get into the fun building stuff phase. There's 4 major steps here. Architect the site, migration mapping, source to destination information. Then you have to build it, and then you start doing, I call this pre-production migrations. So testing the migration code, testing to see if everything's going to be right, but you're not necessarily putting it on the production server yet, or the soon-to-be production server. The goals in the architecture is you need to define the destination or the new content structures, and you have to define the infrastructure with migration considerations, right? So maybe you need an interim server that holds the source database. So like we do a lot of Pantheon migrations. We love Pantheon. We have often we set up the source database on one Pantheon environment and our destination kind of migration destination on another, and we connect the two. So we just you have to know that you have to architect that infrastructure at the beginning of your project. And then at this point, the artifacts, you leverage all the spreadsheets started by the audit. You have that feature development roadmap, and then you have your site architecture spreadsheet, which is basically like roles and text formats, all the things that you need to build. And it's important that you architect the new site with the old information in mind. Because there's some interesting things. Every new entity is a migration pass, right? So who's heard of paragraphs? Yeah? Every time you have a paragraph and you want to migrate into it, that's a completely separate entity migration. So that's a whole development cycle and test cycle and planning cycle and migration cycle. And you're like, oh, and maybe I have to split out content. So it's not even an easy one. It's like, oh, paragraphs are cool, but what does that mean on my migration? Also, media entities require at least 2 passes, one for the file and one for the media entity itself. And you must architect everything before you site build, and never ever let your site builders just build stuff without writing it down and thinking about it and looking at the source data, because happens more often than not, oh, this old field that's 256 characters was built with a 60 character constraint on the new site. Well, what happens to all those other characters when you migrate? Well, they just fall off. Was that good? No. What is the really important thing? What's that? That's crazy, right? So you have to take that very fine detail. What if it's a string to an integer, or an integer to a string? You have to make sure that you take that into consideration in your definition. I talked about paragraphs, but on the new site, they want to use paragraphs, and Commerce does different things, so you have to do a really complex migration for Commerce. And business is getting so excited that they're starting to add new features and requirements, but luckily their new features and requirements aren't on the migrated data, so that's good at this point. And then, after you have the new architecture, you start doing the migration mapping. So what is the old field or database table, column, what does that map to in the new site? And also with each mapping, what is the transformation rules required? What is the field types? What are the considerations? Is this coming from a CSV file, or is it coming from a database? Is it transactional? All sorts of fun things. This is where your spreadsheets come into play, so you can capture each one of these mappings and the associated notes. And this also, what's cool is it tells the developers what to build, but it creates a testing matrix for the data team to look at. Going, oh yeah, I expected the transformation to do this. It's super helpful. And so basically you leverage all the spreadsheets you had before, but then you start creating this migration mapping spreadsheet. And the big one is migration dependencies and the migration order, because migrate in Drupal is fun because it does help allow you to do a migration without doing a lot of dependent migrations before it, but it can get messy and hard to deal with. So what you want to do is migrate things that are required first, like the roles, and then the users, and then the files, and then the media entities. Oh, and then you start doing the content types that reference users and reference media entities. So migration order is key, right? And you have entity references. You have to do the source entity first. Make sure your taxonomies are over first, because you use a lot of that in your supporting content. Also, this is done in parallel with a new architecture. We have to mind the very finer data details, like I brought up. And then if you have to split out like a big WYSIWYG blob into structured content, that may take a lot of extra programming, and you might consider some of those things manual based on how much content you have. And so for our travel, at this phase, we're doing the migration mapping, and they're like, hey, we know that the basic tags need to be split out in a more defined content. So that's cool. That's some development that has to happen on a migration pass. The image field is mapped to a specific media type, so we know how to migrate that. But they come in and say, oh yeah, we want to add Spanish to the site. right? And because we promised that and we forgot to tell you. And you're like, well, great, Drupal 8 is great for multilingual. You could just plop it on, it's not going to really impact the migration. But still, you have to deal with that. Like, oh, or do you just say do that later, right? And that type of thing. So in the development phase, the goals are just get her done. This is where you build everything. You have to re-estimate the work if necessary. You have to go back to the architecture phase if you need to. Like, because you might run into an issue going, hey, I think that we need to re-architect certain things. But in this phase, you're constantly re-educating the client, like if you need to do some course correction. And this is where that Agile meeting structure comes to play, right? A really assertive review and feedback process with the client. The artifacts are the site, the migration code, the infrastructure is set up, and a detailed site rollback process because you want to have that ready for your go live. And that's super, and this go live checklist is awesome. So it's every step you expect that you have to do even a couple of days before you go live. It's everything that you have to do, including like post go live steps. Because you don't want to make it up on the phone when everybody's dialed in to move the site. Hey, we're going to do the site live call, No, you have to practice this and get that written down, and then everybody just does it. It's going to be easy. Doesn't have as much fear as it could. Some considerations here: site building must be complete before migration development starts. No, you can do that. Like if you have a content type defined, you can site build it and then start migration for that, right? So you can migrate and do architecture in a rolling fashion. You can create, but very early, create the migration order with the understanding from your site architecture and your old data. And the developer is responsible for the first creation of that go live checklist. So they'll do like, oh yeah, I ran this command to run this migration, but it's memory hungry and I had to do it in clumps of 1,000. So you have to write that in the notes and stuff like that. And also what you want to do with their development team is help them understand that don't over-engineer the migration code because you're only doing this once. A lot of times you might have to do an incremental migration, but really sometimes that's only going to be lasting for a month, a couple weeks. So if they're having this angst about making their code perfect and beautiful, you just need to make it work. I hate saying that, but you want to do, of course, follow best practices. But if you have to do some really ugly thing because the data needs to transform in a certain way, get it done, right? Just get it done. There's a moment where you're not making art here, you're migrating a website. But here, insert art. Max joins on a MySQL database is 61. So we had 12 content types that were very similar, each with like 55 fields that all had to be joined to make this magic migration, and we hit the max SQL join limit on that, so that's crazy. Also, like comments, you can't migrate those before the parent node is there. You have to, the DOM parsing leads to big memory links, so it's how you write the code is pretty crazy. And you have to watch for the published and unpublished status of the source. Like by default, Drupal migrate doesn't pull in unpublished nodes, so you have to tell it to pull in old nodes or nodes queued up for migration. And also splitting here's the happy, splitting a body field to structured field, good luck. It's fun, it can happen, but you just have to make sure that maybe the source structure is pretty structured. But it's a lot of development there. I'm just going to keep going because I used a couple of samples here. Batches, network latency is a huge one. As one of the developers' homes that they work at has the craziest latency. So you're no, you don't upload files. We'll put those into the test server for you because the network latency is so bad from his house. In the end, the developers with the amount of migrations, it takes 10 minutes to 90 minutes to run the membership migration pass. It takes 16 hours for the initial file copy. How does that time feel for all those project managers out there? What if you have to copy it to like 3 different places? What do you have to start, what if you don't get the access to the data on Monday, but you get it on a Friday? Do you have a developer press the button to, watch the file copy that takes 16 hours just to make it in to fit your project schedule? These things are real, and it impacts everything. So you just have to very early, the minute you see like large numbers or complexity in your audit, you're like, I got to mitigate that early, right? You have to make smart decisions about your project planning. Okay, sorry I'm going long, but hang on, we have 3 more to go. The pre-production migrations, you just keep running the migrations, keep debugging and testing the data. You populate the bulk of the data, and you estimate the duration of the final go live, right? So I know like my migration pass took 90 minutes for the first one, but 10 minutes for incrementals. So it's like, oh cool, the first one's long, but the other ones are like nothing. It's great. But then the artifacts here, you just keep on leveraging your spreadsheets and your go live checklist. This is where you add the tracking the time and any special considerations with like successes or failures of data. And then this is for a test site. They're like, yeah, oops, we forgot, like they did data testing. We forgot like at field XYZ and this data need to be added to migration. So at this point, we have to iterate on site architecture development and everything over and over. Every change, you have to just go back and go, okay, how am I going to architect this? How am I going to implement this? And then you have to develop the migration, test it, and lots of people have to test it. So the migrate plus, cost plus, time plus. So it's going to cost more time. It looks, and it's pretty crazy. But in general, this is kind of another infrastructure, or another look at the project schedule where you can do a lot of like this rolling development, this agile-like development in time terms here, and then you get into the pre-production like test, bug fixes, and incremental migration passes. So it looks like that. Now, if we do the math per migration, if there's 2 hours of definition and 8 hours of development, 120 minutes of migration plus 4 rounds of migration testing, which is like the developer, the client, the migrator, and the data site QA. This is very real. 2 hours of deployment overhead because you have to back up the site, you have to press the button, you have to wait for everybody to get off the site. To total overage hours of that new feature is 20. Addition of 1 possible calendar week because you have to schedule all the people to test it. And you're just increased your budget for $2,000 to $4,000. That's just like adding a couple fields. That's not a big deal. It's just a couple fields, right? No, it's not, because it's a butterfly effect to your project. So just grab that. Now, the closer you get to production, it gets more expensive because you're like, whoa, I actually pre-populated all of these dependent migrations. If I have to roll back from the very beginning, I have to re-roll everything again. Oh no, what's going to be impacted with change on a project? But here, you do the final site testing and the migration audit. And this is where you go live, and then you do your post-launch validation. And that absolutely needs to be within the scope of your project for migrations. Did it work? So the first site testing and data on it, you test the new site architecture with the migrated data in there. You polish the layout and functionality, because a lot of times the themers need a lot of data before they can actually feel like, oh yeah, my CSS is working here. This is where you add additional manual or new content as well. Because at this point the site's pretty much built, the migrations are tested. Then you can have like the customer add this new manual content that they wanted on their site. The artifacts or go live checklist. This is where you do like your deeper browser testing, your SEO testing, your final redirects testing, your performance tuning with that new amount of data you have in the site, and then go live preparation. Get the infrastructure team together, start doing the meetings and get everything scheduled. Call your vendor who's doing the hosting and let them know, hey, we're going to go live in a couple weeks. This is what the plan looks like. And at this point, this is a moment of truth when we have this new 2B production server becomes the non-live production, right? This is that moment in your project that you're like, okay, we could have destroyed that site over and over again because it was quote unquote development. But now we have to treat it just as golden as the real production site because it becomes production, you just haven't switched the DNS to it yet. Because the content editors are going to be adding new content, you don't want to lose that. And rollback can be painful and time consuming and require very specific skills. So. And don't run migrations in your non-live production environment until they've passed through a testing period. Because the minute you start having to roll back completely, data loss, blah, 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 time, money, anger, frustration from the client. That's not fun to deal with. All right, so our use case, that happens, right? They've asked to add more things to their site, so you have to go back and iterate on development, and that is per migration. Let's do the math. There's 2 hours of definition, 8 hours of development, 120 minutes of migration, and 4 rounds of testing. But now we've impacted 3 migrations, so we have to not only just do that migration, we have to roll back other ones and roll them forward again. Total overage hours, 60. Cost up to $24K. And add 2 calendar weeks to your schedule because you just have to line up all these people and have to do a deeper regression on the site. That's real. This is a real project. Does it sound familiar to people? Right? Hey, add this feature. We're almost done, but add this feature. We forgot. But anyway, we're done with that now. We're going to go live. You do the final incremental migrations, like basically you do a code freeze and a site maintenance mode on the real site. You get the last bit of user-generated content, the last orders. On the migration, you have the smooth cutover. You use your go live checklist and DNS. Hey, DNS. And here on the go live is you have to practice before the cutover. The whole team does. And you want to practice your rollback before cutover because they're going to probably ask to be cut over on like a non-peak time, which is probably like Friday evening, right? You're going to have your team maybe go cut to a live site over the weekend maybe just to make sure everything's okay. Your team will probably be tired if it's a big project. You just want to be done. But this is your A game. This is when it really, really matters. And so you have to relax and grab a glass of wine. Maybe, seriously, I have this for our team. Does everybody have their beverage of choice for this? Because something is going to happen. Not just going live. So this is a real thing. On a client, we're doing the go live, we're pressing the buttons, and thank goodness we were pressing a button at an incremental backup. But the hosting DNS failed. And we're like, crap. Because what if that failed in the middle of a migration that we were pointing from the source to the destination server, and it uses DNS, right? And this is real. Like, we just sat there and we're like, wait, we're in the middle of a live migration. We're going live, and it just died. And so we had to just wait for everything to come back up and that type of thing. But it's real. This happens. You're like, wait, that wasn't planned. We checked the infrastructure. There was no scheduled stuff, but it failed. And it failed for 4 hours. So that was Friday night at 6, and it became Friday night at 10 p.m. So the launch took 12 hours versus the 8 due to the outage. So that impacted the how long the other site was going to be down. But the DNS propagated in a timely manner because we got that taken care of when it was finally over. Anyway, that's real. So the post-launch validation, did it work? Did we miss something? And this phase is important because often this is where you're like, oh, I missed a redirect. And you just check the 404 logs. You do speed tests under load, more like real load. You check your error logs, and you get feedback from site users. Oh, did your new feature work? Right? Is your data okay? Or you don't even ask them. They will tell you very quickly, I can't access this or whatever. And in our use case, the 404 log showed some missing redirects. The vendors were happy with their new features, and some data expected was missing because the business actually decided not to carry that over. And the takeaways for this Todd, thanks for being patient. The incomplete requirements and equals rework and increased time and cost. And for those that are on fixed bid type of engagements, this is challenging for all parties involved. Migration work is exponentially longer due to the nature of development and testing. So you want to start educating your sponsors early, your project sponsors early with this. And your team may change over time if it's a very long and complex project, or if you need to pull additional resources on to pull the calendar, the schedule in. Write everything down, because then you can very quickly get someone up to speed on your project. Questions? Go for it.
From a PM point of view, this is fantastic, right? And as a PM, I totally relate with this. But what were some of the challenges that your developers faced when working through this process? Where did you get pushback, things like that?
Okay, the question is, as a PM, it makes sense, but as developers, where does the pushback happen? The worst thing a developer can have is no requirements. So if we go back to all the phases, there's all these artifacts, and that needs to be done. Like, you need to have sign-off. You need to have something stable enough for them to build. Don't even get your developer involved unless they're the architect doing like the audits or the site. We love to have our developers actually run a lot of the audit in conjunction with an architect, because they start looking at the old data and they start getting familiar with it, and we carry that person through to the life of the project so they understand innately. It becomes tacit knowledge to them. But we still write it down, because then we're like, oh, let's pull someone else on to run this migration pass. But it's very clear what's expected, and then they can ask the other people on the team. So it all comes down to having clear requirements and a clear architecture. But you also make sure that they know what they're doing. If you don't have someone that's run migration before, have them. Like, a lot of times I do say, if you have an internal team, give them a week or so and a couple of sample tasks to start like playing with migrations. It's like, if you expect a CSV-based migration, have them run a little site, have them make a content type and throw in CSV against it, right? If you know that you're going to connect to an old, like, archaic database, have them do that. Have them connect to them and like have them go through it. You want to make sure that there's some research and discovery for your team to prepare if they haven't done it. Give them time that's not under the crunch to get familiar with it. Does that help?
Yeah.
Okay, great. Anything else? Yeah.
Are there any like differences that you've seen, like migrating into a Drupal 7 site is different than migrating into a Drupal 8 site? Have you done any Drupal 8 migrations, and what are some differences between the two that you've seen?
Right, the question is migrating into Drupal 7 and migrating into Drupal 8. Yeah, they're amazingly similar, actually. The Drupal 8 environment has a little bit of different language, what they call like the different, on the development level, the different processors, right? But conceptually, it's really similar. Like, we have people that easily went from Drupal 7 migrate to Drupal 8. And then also the Drupal to Drupal migration modules, very similar, right? It's there's some new features in Drupal 8, like the big red button feature, which is like migrate my whole site for me, because it's a pretty well-defined Drupal 6 site. Just press the button for Drupal 8. That's maybe good for smaller, like non-complex sites, but it's a consideration that needs to be done. But in general, all of these concepts apply to both, because we've done big D7 migrations and big D8 ones. It's the same, right? It's just the biggest considerations for the D8 ones is the use of media entities, because it's like not just a file pass, it's a file and then entity. Every media entity you define, you have to run a pass for that. And also paragraphs. If you're using paragraphs to contain data, structured data, then you have to run. So it's basically every custom entity you have to run a migration pass for. And if you're doing like commerce, then you have to do like 10 migration passes, because there's an order entity and the item entity and then the transaction entity and blah, 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 blah. So, but that's also for Drupal 7. right? Because you have custom entities in Drupal 7. It's just everything is an entity in Drupal 8, so you have more concepts of that. And this is where dependency work really comes into play, right? So does that help answer? Yeah, okay. Any other questions? Wow, no questions? How do you feel? Do I have a feeling slide? I don't remember if I put. No, I didn't put a feeling slide in the end. Do you guys feel like a superhero now? Maybe in the middle. Question of Steve.
So, leaving at all the technology and all the great challenges that you have shared, what's been your experience focusing on the true stakeholder, like the person or people that are actually funding the project? How do you ease them into the whole concept of it costs money and it takes time? Because different personalities have different perspectives on how they want to engage in that.
Yeah, the question was from the PM level, minus all technological fun things. How do you help? It's like the account management of the sponsors, the people with the money. That's a good question, and it depends on the infrastructure culture or the business culture and how they are used to running. We have a huge ethical and transparent, fully transparent type of method of working. So we'll just honestly say, wow, we don't know at the very beginning, let's get into an audit. And then and then that will help mitigate the spend for them and help set the proper expectations. And that's why earlier we're like, you should do phases of migration if you have a big complex site or even a medium site and you just don't know. Because then they can have more points, more data points for making purchasing decisions. They don't have to make the big account. They don't have to purchase the whole thing at the beginning. They can go, tell me what I'm dealing with first. So it's mitigating it by more palpable chunks of work, right? Being transparent, being very open, and educating them about what migrations look like. It's like having this information and going through something like this, maybe not at the super technical level, but like, this is what the project phases look like. This is where it can get long. This is why we have requirement sign-off, because we save money and time doing that. If you say that very early, then they start understanding. And it actually it empowers them to go, okay, we'll take longer on discovery so we really know what we want, right? So which phases become long, right? Does that help? Okay, thank you. Anything else? Okay, we went long, but you guys totally hung in there. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. My booth is right out, my table's right out here. If you have any questions, I'll be happy to talk about it. I'm very passionate about this. Thanks.